Hey there, it's Amanda with World in a Nutshell, and today we're going to be talking about the U.S. government in a nutshell. Are you ready? The United States formally became the United States when the Declaration of Independence was signed officially, that is, on July 4th, 1776. The document's primary author, Thomas Jefferson, set out to explain to Britain exactly why the colonies were breaking up with their mother country and why they had the right to cut those ties with Britain. His explanation was largely based on the ideas of the 17th century British philosopher John Locke, who suggested the governments were created by people, or men specifically, in order to protect our natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Jefferson only changed the last portion to the pursuit of happiness to give the sentiment a broader meaning beyond just material wealth. Happiness, for instance, can come from giving away your property. He also wrote that it is obvious or self-evident that all men are created equal. This claim was repeated by Lincoln many years later during the Civil War in his Gettysburg Address. Following the preamble, Jefferson listed all the perceived abuses that were committed by the tyrannical British King George III, even though most of the taxes and the decisions regarding the colonies were made by the Parliament. After the Declaration of Independence, the Second Continental Congress set out to create a set of rules for the new country called the Articles of Confederation. A confederation is a loose alliance of groups, in this case states, that were united in a league of friendship. The central power under the Articles of Confederation was very weak, which was preferable to what was believed to be the oppressive, centralized control of the British government in London. Each of the 13 states kept the power to tax, to trade, to make local laws, to maintain a militia, to coin their own money. And without regard to the size of the population, each state had a single vote in the unicameral, that is, one house legislature. The government, though, did not have the power to regulate trade between the states. They didn't have the power to collect taxes from the states. They didn't even have the power to enforce laws that they drew up. And any changes to the Articles of Confederation had to be approved by all 13 states, which seemed to be an impossible task. More on that later. However, the central government could coordinate the common defense and negotiate terms with foreign treaties. This was very useful as the colonies concluded their war with Britain successfully with the help of France, Spain, and the Netherlands, and signed the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783. However, that weak government did not suit the country during peacetime. After the War of Independence, otherwise known as the American Revolution, states independently raised taxes to replenish their own treasuries. This was considered completely unacceptable to poor farmers and veterans who had just finished fighting a war with Britain over high taxes, and they were in debt themselves. Led by Daniel Shays, farmers and veterans from Western Massachusetts rose in rebellion against the local government in Boston. And this almost caused a civil war in the state. Initially, Massachusetts could not put down the rebellion because their military was disbanded, which was a condition of the Articles of Confederation. And the National Congress was no help either because it didn't have the power, the means, or the funds to get involved. Shays' rebellion, as it was called, convinced high-profile Americans that the federal government, as it stood, was too weak to protect and govern the United States. To fix the problem, in May 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island didn't attend, met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. But they knew that any changes, which again required all 13 states, would be very difficult to accomplish. Therefore, behind shuttered windows, they decided to scrap the old document altogether and create a brand new constitution, the Constitution that is still used today. So, the Constitution begins with an introduction penned mostly by Gouverneur Morris that outlines the purpose of the document. We, the people of the United States, notably not the king, not nobles, not the states, but the people, in order to form a more perfect union that is even better or more perfect than the one created by the Articles of Confederation. Establish justice, ensure domestic or homegrown tranquility, peace, which was a reference to the domestic upheaval in Massachusetts or Shays' Rebellion, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Posterity is just the future generations. The document was then divided into 7 articles. The first article dealt with the legislature, that is the lawmaking branch of government, and they started here because this is the branch that was most answerable to the people since the population voted directly for the members of the House of Representatives. More on that later. The second article outlined the requirements and role of the executive branch, that is the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. Back then, the Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury. The third article deals with the judicial branch, or the courts. The fourth has to do with the states. The fifth explains how the Constitution can be amended or changed. The sixth says that the laws of the United States, that is, the laws of the federal government, shall be the supreme law of the land. And lastly, the seventh article simply discusses the rules for getting the Constitution ratified. There were a number of compromises made during the process to create a constitution that they hoped would last for generations, and, well, it did. Among them was representation in the Congress. Under the Articles of Confederation, if you remember, each state was represented equally despite the size of the population. And this was all in a unicameral or one-house legislature. This meant that little tiny New Jersey and very populous Virginia had equal representation. Not surprisingly, New Jersey liked this arrangement and wanted to keep this in the Constitution. Virginians, however, proposed a bicameral two-house legislature with the number of representatives in each of the houses decided by population. A compromise was made in the current Constitution, which is my segue into Article 1. Article 1 focused on the legislative or lawmaking branch of the government. To compromise between the New Jersey and the Virginia plans, the framers of the Constitution decided to create a bicameral or two-house legislature with an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. The upper house, called the Senate, from the Latin root senex for old man, where we also get the words senior and senile, no connection, I promise, was composed of 2 senators from each state. Back then, that meant 26 senators representing 13 states. Today, we have 100 senators representing 50 states. To qualify for the office, senators must be at least 35 years old and a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years. At the time the Constitution was written, U.S. senators were elected by state legislatures, not the people. This changed in 1913 with the 17th Amendment dictating that senators would be elected directly by the people. Senators in the upper house are selected for 6-year terms and run for re-election in staggered terms. So a third of the senators are elected every 2 years. The lower house, or House of Representatives, is made up of representatives based on the population of each state. At the time, for instance, Virginia had 10 representatives, Massachusetts had 8, Rhode Island had 1. Making things a bit confusing, though, at the time the Constitution was written, there was still slavery. So it was decided in another compromise that the number of representatives in slave states would be calculated by adding the number of free people and 3/5 of everyone else.
The word slave, incidentally, was never used in the Constitution, but it was understood that 3/5 of the slaves would be counted for both taxation and representation purposes, but would not be able to vote. This part was amended in 1868 with the passage of the 14th Amendment that declared that all people born in the U.S. are citizens. This is known as birthright citizenship and would be counted equally. In the 15th Amendment, all male citizens would be able to legally vote, and in the 19th, that privilege was extended to women. As the population grew, so did the number of representatives until in 1929 it was decided that the total number of representatives would be capped at 435. To qualify, members of the House of Representatives must be at least 25 years old, a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and a resident of the state that they represent. Members of the representatives are elected directly by the people for 2-year terms. And that's why we have midterm elections in the middle of the president's 4-year term. The shorter terms were intended to ensure that the representatives were more accountable to public opinion and changing trends compared to senators who serve 6-year terms.
The U.S. Congress, which is the collective name for the legislative branch of the government, has many responsibilities that are outlined in Section 8 of Article 1. Among them, they can create and collect taxes, borrow and coin money, regulate trade among the states and with foreign countries, establish post offices, declare war, raise and maintain a military, and determine how immigrants can become citizens or become naturalized. The most important job of Congress, however, is to legislate, that is, to make laws that are deemed necessary and proper. A bill or proposed law can be introduced by the House, the Senate, or even the President, except money-related bills, which can only start in the House. To become a law, the bill must have the approval of a simple majority, that is, more than 50%, of both the House and the Senate, and then it is sent to the President for approval. The President can accept the bill, making it a full-fledged law, woohoo, or can veto it. However, a presidential veto can be overridden by the Congress with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. If, however, the president ignores the bill while the Congress is no longer in session, it is vetoed by default and cannot be overridden by Congress. That is called a pocket veto, as in the president stuck it in his or her pocket and forgot about it. More on the president's requirements and responsibilities are listed in Article 2 regarding the executive branch of the government. The President of the United States, or POTUS, is elected to a 4-year term, limited to 2 terms in 1951 by the 22nd Amendment, according to the Electoral College system. Each state is allotted a number of electoral votes based on the number of representatives the state has in the House of Representatives, plus 2 senators. The least number of electoral votes a state can have is 3. That is 1 representative in the House of Representatives, which is based on population size, plus 2 senators, totaling 538 electoral votes. The number of representatives in the House, 435 plus 100 senators, 2 for each state. But wait, that math doesn't add up. Did you notice? And that's because in 1961, 3 electoral votes were also given to voters living in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, the nation's capital. I talk more about this in the Constitutional Amendments video. In almost all of the states, the electoral votes are all given to the candidate who wins a majority of votes in the state, or winner take all. For example, if 51% of Californians voted for the Democratic candidate, all 54 electoral votes would go to that candidate. The president wins when they get more than half of the electoral votes, or 270. Although the US is a democracy, the US president is not directly elected by popular vote. And back to Article 2, in order to be eligible, the president must be a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the U.S. at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. That's written because the first 7 presidents were not actually born in the United States. He or she must be at least 35 years old and have lived in the United States for at least 15 years. The main job of the executive, aside from being the head of government, is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, which the president promises to do in the oath of office declared on Inauguration Day on January 20th, or the following day of January 20th falls on a Sunday. He or she also oversees the whole executive branch, which today has over 4 million people, including the military, which makes the president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The president also creates and implements U.S. foreign policy and has the power to make treaties and appoint ambassadors. A very important privilege of the president in law, and one of the many checks and balances that ensure that none of the 3 branches of government has too much power, the president has the right to appoint Supreme Court justices with the approval of Congress. The president also can pardon criminals, or traditionally during Thanksgiving, one lucky turkey. And legislatively, the president can suggest laws, which then have to go through Congress, or, as I said before, can pass or veto bills that come from Congress. The Congress can also check the president's power by threatening impeachment. The President of the United States can be impeached or charged by the House of Representatives in Article 2, Section 4, for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. If the House of Representatives votes by a simple majority to impeach the president, the case will go to the Senate, which can convict and remove the president from office with a 2/3 vote. No president has yet been removed from power this way, and only 3, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump twice, have been impeached. Richard Nixon, by the way, resigned before the Senate began impeachment proceedings because of the Watergate scandal. As for the vice president, the primary responsibility of the vice president is to serve as the president if the president is temporarily or permanently incapacitated or impeached. For instance, if a president has to go to surgery, the vice president will temporarily act on his or her behalf. In 8 cases, the vice president took office after the president died. In 4 of these cases, because of assassination: William Henry Harrison, 1841, Zachary Taylor, 1850, Abraham Lincoln, 1865, James Garfield, 1881, William McKinley, 1901, Warren G. Harding, 1923, Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1945, and John F. Kennedy in 1963 after he was assassinated. And in one case, the vice president, Gerald Ford, took power after President Richard Nixon resigned in 1974. The vice president is also the president of the Senate, but can only cast a tie-breaking vote. Remember, there are 2 senators from each state, resulting in an even number. So that tie-breaking role could make a difference. And that's about it. Or as John Adams said, he was the first vice president, it is the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. Incidentally, if both the president and the vice president die, the position of president goes to the Speaker of the House. And then the president pro tempore, the Senate, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and Secretary of Homeland Security. And everyone in those positions must meet the constitutional requirements for the presidency. That means they must be at least 35 years old, a natural-born citizen, and a U.S. resident for at least 14 states. They also cannot have been a former president who has already served 2 terms, since according to the 22nd Amendment ratified in 1951, U.S. presidents are limited to 2 terms. Now, on to Article 3. Article 3 discusses the court system in the United States, beginning with the Supreme Court, or SCOTA, Supreme Court of the United States, which in 1869 has been set at 9 members, including a Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices who are appointed by the President with the approval of the Senate for a life term. The Supreme Court is the last court, or appellate court of the land, which means it reviews cases only about 70 to 80 a year that started in lower courts but were appealed because of constitutional issues. For example, in the Brown versus Board of Education case in the 1950s, the plaintiffs, from the word complain, argued that separate but equal facilities for Black and white Americans was unconstitutional since it violated the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection of the laws. Article 4 of the Constitution deals with the states and the relationship between the states. The U.S. is a federalist system, which means that power is shared between the federal government and the states. Each state has their own miniature version of the federal government, including executive power, a legislative, and judicial branches. The executive is led by the governor, and state legislatures have their own state House of Representatives and their own state Senate, except Nebraska. They also have their own court systems as well. And Article 4 also deals with the requirements and responsibilities of the states, including honoring the contracts and decisions that were made in other states and giving citizens from other states the same rights that are given to their own local citizens. The states are also responsible for extraditing fugitives from justice, that is, sending them back to the states from which the criminals committed their crimes. Before the Civil War, this included the requirements that states return runaway slaves back to the states from where they came. Although instead of using the word slave, it just says people held to service or labor. Article 5 explains how the Constitution can be amended or changed. The framers wanted this process to be difficult, but not as difficult as it was under the Articles of Confederation, which required unanimous approval by all 13 states. According to the Constitution, there are a couple of ways that an amendment can be made. Amendments can be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, or by legislatures of 2/3 of the states in a national convention. That second process has never been done. It then must be ratified by an approval of 3/4 of the states, that is 38 out of 50, which is the pathway for all but one of the 27 amendments, or by specially elected state conventions in 3/4 of the state. This happened only once for the 21st Amendment. And if you know anything about the United States, you know that this would be very difficult to get a consensus of 3/4 of the states and 3/4 of Congress. That's why out of more than 11,000 amendment proposals, including the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, which gave women equal rights to men, only 27 made the cut, with the last one being ratified in 1992. I will talk about all 27 amendments in the next video. As mentioned earlier, the United States uses a federalist system with power divided or shared between the central government and state governments. Whatever areas of governance are not decided by the federal government are left to the states. It says it directly in the 10th Amendment that says that powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people. For example, states can make laws that deal with family matters like marriage, divorce, child custody laws, or employment laws like minimum wage. However, Article 6 decrees that federal laws are the supreme law of the land. Therefore, states cannot make any laws that conflict with federal laws. In the example of the minimum wage, for instance, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. States can set their own minimum wage, and you'll see a huge variety, but it has to be above the federal minimum wage law. And lastly, Article 7, only used one time and the shortest of the articles. It simply said that the Constitution would officially replace the Articles of Confederation once it was ratified by 9 of the 13 states. The logic behind this decision was that the other 4 could not survive without the original 9. To help generate support, proponents of the new Constitution, who called themselves the Federalists, published a number of Federalist papers. One paper, Federalist Number 10, written by James Madison, argued that a large republic represents so many diverse interests that it will protect the population from the power of small factions like religious sects or wealthy moguls or the KKK. In Federalist Paper Number 51, Madison also assured critics that the checks and balances that were written into the Constitution would prevent any branch from becoming tyrannical. On January 9th, 1788, 5 states had ratified the Constitution: Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. The rest, however, were swayed by the anti-federalists, who argued that individuals' and states' rights would only be protected through a Bill of Rights that guaranteed personal freedoms. When it was agreed that a Bill of Rights would be attached to the Constitution in the form of amendments, the first 10 amendments, Massachusetts ratified the Constitution, followed by Maryland, South Carolina, and the 9th state, New Hampshire, officially making the Constitution the new law of the land. Virginia eventually followed, then New York, North Carolina, and kicking and screaming, Rhode Island, the last holdout, ratified the Constitution May 29, 1789. And there you have it, the U.S. government in a nutshell. And don't forget to catch the next episode that gives you an explanation of the 27 amendments. Until then, have a great day.